we have, by your presence, circumvented the ending of the National Endowment for the Arts because the National Endowment for the Arts ends today. So we had planned to do this in July, and I'm sorry that we are a little delayed, but thank you so much. I'm able to give people some honorariums and fly people from Kansas and a few other things thanks to this. All right, I'm not going to do a lengthy introduction because I think most of you know the watershed, but for those of you who are new to the area, I just want to share that there is a lot of importance in this area that people aren't always aware of. 90% of the water for New York City comes from this region. And there is really a lot of lacking infrastructure in the community. Small businesses have to pay for special treatment of their water services in order to make sure that people in New York City don't have to build a treatment plant. And there is a lot of need in these areas for things like education, design, transportation. One of the reasons we're behind today is because neither of our interns could come in yesterday because they didn't have a ride. So I just want to thank you for being here to start a conversation which I think can be really positive. We have some really brilliant minds in the room, both local people and visitors, and we're hoping that maybe we put together some thoughts about rural small towns across America, because even though we are the only ones, hello? You guys, are we here? Yeah. We are the only ones who are, right here, right now. I think these issues really go across the country. Is there something wrong with the mic? Okay. Well, are we? Okay. So I'm going to begin by asking Anna Musser, who is finishing her PhD dissertation at University of Pennsylvania and also a faculty member there. Her work is about the history emotionally of the watershed communities, and she will tell you what she's been thinking and learning about as we go. She also has a series of prints in the front room, and we'll be doing an exhibition walkthrough at 5:30. Thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to Anna.
Thank you very much. I am thrilled to be here today, and I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, thank you very much. So, Nancy, thank you for the invitation to be here and for pulling together this program on the new accelerated timeline. Yes, I am a historian of science, technology, and the environment, and I completed my PhD in the history and sociology of science at the University of Pennsylvania. I'll be starting as a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University in the fall. And so my first book project is all about New York City's watershed and the history of the way that people have related to these reservoirs, the places that have been transformed through the management of this water supply, and the collective memories that people have accessed and activated over the last century. So there's so many things I could talk about with you all today, and after chatting with Nancy and especially with the timeline, I decided that the best thing was to give you a little bit of kind of a case study into one example of collective memory and how these stories are produced in the watershed over the last century. So I'll be drawing from an article that I published in the journal Agricultural History last year. So for a short introduction, I'm going to just say a few words about the concept of collective memory and why I think it's so important to study. And I'm happy to get into any depth during discussion, but I'm going to keep that part pretty brief. And then I'll talk about the set of stories and narratives and collective memories that I have seen in my research centered in the watershed over the past 75 or so years. And these have to do with farms in the watershed. And then in the core of my talk, I'm going to discuss the agricultural history of farm decline and how this intersected with reservoir construction in this area. Overall, I argue that the story that New York City took the best farms in the region was formulated through these overlapping experiences of farm crises and decline at the same time as reservoir construction, displacement, and eminent domain takings. So based on that, I'll then talk a little bit about how the memory of these lost farms was put to work and mobilized at different moments in this region. And again, that's something that I could go into in lots of depth, but I'm going to keep it pretty short for today. But this is really the topic of my whole first book. And then I'll close with just a few kind of reflections about, again, why this kind of research matters. So, collective memory is typically a way to think about shared stories, narratives, assumptions, and beliefs about the past within a given group. So, of course, there are always going to be multiple different collective memories about a place or about an event, but they're really important because these are the stories that people tell to establish belonging within a group and to a place, to understand local history, and to understand both past, present, and future politics. So this is a really huge topic, and I'm happy to get into the lineage of collective memory coming out of Holocaust studies in the late 20th century. But for here, I just want to emphasize that something that's really important about the idea of collective memory is that it's always political. And the reason that it's political is that collective memories are stories about the past, but they're formulated in the present, and so they are actually also stories about the future. They're about what is possible, what is not possible, what is implied, what there is sort of precedent for, and so ideas about what's happened in the past become really important for determining, say, in this region, what kind of regulations will shape daily activities. So the collective memory I'm talking about today is about the best farms in the Catskills. So there's this story that I mentioned, that when New York City built the reservoirs in the region, they flooded the best farms in the area. And you see this story in all sorts of places. So for a couple examples, there's a newspaper article from 1953. Notice the article here leads with the idea that the best farms in the area are being taken by the city. Here's another. This example is from an eminent domain hearing in 1961. It's from the transcript of this hearing. And the lawyer is questioning an expert from Cornell University about the kind of soil. And the expert explains that the soil on that particular farm, which is now under the Cannonsville Reservoir, was, quote, a very large portion of the real good agricultural land in the county. So the critical thing I want to highlight here is how this story about these very best farms in the region being lost to New York City's reservoirs was being formulated at the same moment that those farms were disappearing and the reservoirs were being constructed. And yes, I do want to emphasize, farming on a flat river bottom valley is easier than farming on a gravelly hilltop like we have here in the Catskills. But my argument based on this research is that the story is doing much more than simply stating that pattern. So to show you that context, I'm going to turn to the history of farms in this region and to some extent nationally. In many senses, the history of agriculture in the United States is a history of crisis after crisis, starting well before the 20th century's explosion in industrial farming and before the sort of massive expansion of industrial fertilizers and pesticides after the Second World War. So I'm happy to get into earlier farm crises like the 1820s soil fertility crisis or the moment in the 1820s also when the Catskills wheat market collapsed because the Erie Canal opened, bringing inexpensive wheat from the Midwest, or what happened to the export market nationally after the First World War. But today I'm sticking with New York City and the Catskill watershed. So can you see my mouse on the screen?
Yes.
I'm moving my mouse around. Is that
Yes,
visible
yes,
or no?
we can.
Fantastic. Okay, so there are these two charts, and both of them are based on data from the New York State and the Federal Census of Agriculture. So, of course, what a farm is in those kind of documents is constructed and made out of different decisions at different moments and changes over this period. So we can't take this as a perfect accounting, but it's a useful pattern and trend. So what we see here is these two charts charting the total number of farms in the middle Atlantic states, so New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, and in the watershed counties in the rural Catskills region. So on the left here are these watershed farms, and on the right are the mid-Atlantic farms. And what I want to highlight is that these trends are very similar. Though you actually see a slightly slower decline in this blue line, this is Delaware County, than you do elsewhere. And that holds for a bunch of different reasons. But the major pattern here is that over the 20th century, the number of farms throughout states in the northeastern U.S. declined across the board. Starting in the 1920s, new agricultural experts were pushing farmers to expand and treat their land as factories, using more standardized practices. Then in the post-war years especially, farming became more equipment and capital intensive, which made it harder to survive on smaller plots of land and uneven parcels like we have in the Catskills. So now I want you to take this pattern and think about it in the context of when New York City's reservoirs were built. So here's that same chart of the farms in watershed counties, and I've overlaid it with these translucent bars showing the construction periods of the different major reservoirs here. So you can, I keep wanting to point with my hands, I'm used to speaking in person. So you can see here is the Ashokan Reservoir, 1907 to 1917. Then we have Schoharie, which is the one closest to you all in Prattsville. And so you can see this pattern going across the 20th century. Notice that after the reservoirs were built, of course, this trend continued, and it sometimes sped up, as we see here. The result is that life before and after these reservoirs were built had changed dramatically. This is to say, during the same period that people were losing their homes to reservoir valleys, they were also watching the agricultural landscape around them change. So take, for example, the Papacton and Cannonsville reservoirs here in the two shades of blue. They were built in the late 1940s to mid-1960s. For these two reservoirs, a total of 207 farms were taken by New York City. In that same period, Delaware County as a whole lost more than 2,000 farms. So there's a much larger trend at work here. What I want to emphasize is that the farms that closed or relocated, because we only know if a farm was taken, we don't necessarily know from the data that New York City can provide which farms were reopened elsewhere. So I know some of that, but I don't have a full accounting. So the farms that closed or relocated because of reservoirs have had a particularly powerful rhetorical and narrative power in the Catskills. I argue that the figure of these lost farms has acted as a metonym for past agricultural and rural lifeways in the 20th century. This farmland, lying under the reservoirs, offers a narrative site through which loss and anxieties about changes in rural life could be expressed. So this brings me back to the collective memory of farms in the region. In the 1980s, the United States went through a dramatic farm crisis, which many folks here today might remember. In the watershed area, the impacts were not as extreme as some of the stories that were reported in the national news from the Midwest, but it was still devastating. From the period of the late 70s, before the farm crisis, to the end of the 1980s, when it was ending, Delaware County lost almost 40% of its remaining farms. By the end of the 1980s, both farm and non-farm communities in rural New York had passed through a social and economic storm. So this was the context in which people in this watershed greeted New York City's new proposed watershed regulations, which were announced in 1990. So what do these things have to do with collective memories about best farms? These stories became part of how people in this area mobilized, organized, and galvanized to work to advocate for the Catskills in terms of these negotiations. So here's a few examples. So this is a quote from a video produced by the Coalition of Watershed Towns in 1991. So I've written as if folks are familiar, but for those who aren't, the details of this particular history are quite complex, and I'm happy to talk about it. But in short, the Coalition of Watershed Towns and the Watershed Agricultural Council were both organized in the early 1990s to push back against New York City's new proposed regulations, which would have, among other things, made agriculture in the region almost impossible. So there's this quote from this tape produced by the Coalition of Watershed Towns early on. The city took out 50 of the best farms in that area. It was the best farmland in that town, river valleys and that sort of thing. It was beautiful farms down there. Everything was practically wiped out. And here's another quote, this one from an oral history interview conducted in 1992. This is someone who had grown up in one of the reservoir valleys, and he blamed New York City for the lost farms. He said, the farming community would have still been there. I mean, the farms, I think, would have stayed because they were productive farms. Now, my point here is not to apportion blame or exonerate past decisions. What I want to highlight is the impact and the affect of these collective memories. These narratives were effective ways of galvanizing farmers and other residents to organize and negotiate with New York City in the 1990s, which resulted in the Memorandum of Agreement in 1997 and many of the programs that that many folks use today. And part of what brings us here today is sort of the knowledge of the Catskill Watershed Corporation and the Watershed Agricultural Council and the programs that they do offer. So, part of why these memories matter is because of the framing and the arguments that they justify or suggest or explain. So I said at the beginning that collective memories are always political. They are part of establishing who is and is not part of a group, who belongs and where, what a place means and what it may be used for, what can be done, what can be justified. So folks may be familiar with the concept of a sacrificial landscape. It's often used to describe Cancer Alley in the along the Gulf Coast. That's a story about a place that has been so contaminated that it already does not justify further protection or action to protect people and ecosystems in that place. So it's an extreme example, but what I'm highlighting here is that the politics of these memories really matter. A story that says that New York City is to blame for the disappearing agricultural landscape is incomplete. It's a story that externalizes changes in American life after the Second World War, locating them with New York City in a way that reinforces rural-urban resentment without offering a path forward. The complex history of this region, of its farms, its waters, and its residents, shows that rural and urban life have been entangled since the earliest days of white settlement. It was the combination of cheap wheat shipped on the Erie Canal and speedy rail lines to New York City that turned the Catskills into dairy country in the 19th century, in fact. And because of the activism and patient negotiations in the 1990s, ongoing investments from New York City have helped sustain agricultural lifeways during a period of continuing rapidly changing farming landscapes. So what I really want to emphasize here is that this history shows us that these places can't be neatly separated, and if we try to do so, we miss the bigger trends that unite them. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. I'm going to go ahead and let Richard do his presentation, and then we'll hear from Ted about what's going on in the region right now, and then we'll have a little bit of a discussion amongst the gathered audience here. So,
okay, fantastic.
Richard?
Yeah, hi there, everyone. Anna, that was amazing. Thank you for sharing your work. Certainly was resonant for me. Okay, let's see here.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be here.
Can you all see that? Are you showing screen there?
It looks quite white, actually.
White. That's interesting. It was working earlier. Let's see here.
Well, I see it now. You can just show it like this.
Yeah. I think that looks good.
It does.
Right?
Yeah. It looks fantastic.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah. Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm zooming in from Boulder, Colorado, where I teach in the Department of Art and Art History. I focus my artwork around M12 Studio, which is a collaborative practice, and we operate as both a nonprofit and a studio. We do a lot of things that worked all over the world, but I think for today, I just wanted to sort of share kind of some of the things that we do that relate to kind of rural landscape and the spatial complexity that's there. And so, yeah, so we've worked all over, but the last 5 years or so, we've really been kind of focused on the Platte River watershed and into the Ogallala aquifer. These are sort of right in the center of the U.S. And our working kind of canvas in some ways has been the quote unquote American West, which you kind of see here in terms of where we work. It's a combination of prairie grass, of course, tons of farms, and then forested mountain ranges through the Rockies, of course. So I highlight this because sort of quote-unquote flyover country often is thought of as not being very complex. So if I sort of spin this space around the planet a little bit, that same sort of square mileage there shows us like how many different kind of complexities we could be working with, and I think they're quite there. So, oh, what happened there?
Richard, your slides weren't showing.
Oh,
Now we can see it.
did you see the last slides?
We did not. We just saw
Now
the title page.
Okay, where did they go out?
Your first slide.
Oh, jeez. Okay. All right, I'm going to roll through this really quick so you can see the images. Okay. These are just some images of the Platte River watershed, and then here. Okay, I think these are important to see. Yeah. So here you see the sort of quote unquote flyover country. Sort of combinations, and then I'm going to sort of show that on the Earth map. So there it is, sort of thrown over another part of the country, right? So in 2015, 2016, we were just doing a lot of reflection about this, really the notion of homesteading place. It was also the time period when the first Trump administration was gathering steam, and we were seeing, some changes. And so, to be self-critical, I think is good. So, there's this passage from the Nebraska line almost to the Rio Grande. There are thousands of abandoned homesteads, gaunt and poor, weathered and gray with heaps of tumbleweeds. They stand alone in the treeless expanse of drifting dust and sand where plowed fields used to be. Each of them claims the sort of respect we accord a place where a battle with much at stake has been fought and lost. And this sort of gloozing, I think, in a way, is something that we wanted to think about and kind of, do something in regards to this condition. And so that led us to this project called the Last Chance Module Array that was helped in large part by the NEA. And this is located in Last Chance, Colorado. It's population 12, sits up on a hill. And it's so I'm showing this to sort of give a sense of the studio and the land-based sort of work that we do. So you can sort of go and find this piece, see it. There are thousands of different kind of geometric and also just sort of different points of perspective around this 40-acre site. And so at once it's sort of a ghost. That piece is a ghost in a lot of ways. But it sits there, and you wonder if it might be something being built or if it's something falling down. And that's the kind of in-between space that we're pretty interested in, right? So we go from that sort of clean look that came out of that piece to wanting to share here a bit about our Rural Environments Archive, which is everything but minimal. And it chases everything from false fronts in architecture that also of course deal with the history of the American West to roadside architecture. We work with field research and direct observation, sort of in the style of the Center for Land Use Interpretation on the front end. We do a lot of documentation in terms of what's happening in different rural areas, with the concentration really being on creating imagery that's kind of focused on the rural-urban divide, foodways, water, and land use. These are some images from that archive. We also strongly believe in collaboration and group work. We're all getting a little bit older, so we're recruiting new people to help lift all this stuff. But yeah, no, it's a way that we've worked since our founding, and we're a small artist organization. We have a board of 8, but they're all practicing artists, and our board operates as a concept board more than a development board. We also do and believe in durational outdoor projects. We have projects that have been going on 10, 15 years in different places. This one's the Black Hornet. It's a circle track race car. We collaborate with the family on every year creating a new model. Okay, so in that sort of vein, I was asked to talk a little bit about 2 projects. The first one being Tracing the Ogallala, focused on the TAP, which was a project we completed in shallow water, Texas, in 2023. And so in this sort of thinking, the image on the left, of course, is an aerial of all the irrigation pivots, probably all on land that it makes no sense. But the TAP took us to Lubbock, Texas, when we were deeply thinking about groundwater, and both the remnants of this sort of westward expansion, and then also our current moment and the current condition. And so, of course, again, we're focused on the Great Plains, and there you see just a couple graphs of where that in the bottom here, if you can see my cursor, this sort of large underwater or under land body of water, sometimes called the High Plains Aquifer or the Ogallala Aquifer, and it's important because it provides water for all of those areas that we think of as flyover country. It's about 1/3 of the agriculture in the U.S. that's produced in that area. So we were asked to come to Texas Tech and do a show, and one of the things that we do is we collaborate with lots of different people who aren't artists. And these are images that we worked with the High Plains Water District, one of the High Plains Water Districts on, and basically went through their archive of approved well sites, and that's what you're seeing here. Each dot is a sort of approved well around Lubbock, and so what we were asked to come there because their wells are going dry for the large farms, and so. Yeah, so we went and we did this into our exhibition, and filled this tank with water, sort of a sound piece, meditative space. We also were able to get the rights to the song "Cool Water" and the Gene Autry show episode, and then in the gallery space we also had a replica of the tap. So this is the on-site project, and usually it's typical in the studio that we're working. Probably with an institution, indoors somewhere, and then we're also working outside on site. And so here we work specifically with a farm that operates as part tourism farm, and they're expanding to become an art center now. We were able to tap right into the aquifer. So this piece lives inside the grain bin. It's one tap straight down to the quote-unquote fossil water. We invite people to come into this space. That's the way it operates. It's the first stop on the tour. Eric Simpson is the farmer and artist who lives there, and so this is the first place that they go when you enter the farm, and it's really to talk about the criticality of what's underneath them. In the region. And so, yeah, during that process, I mentioned we collaborate a lot with outside of art, institutions and people. One of these are images from the Playa Lakes joint venture, another group that we started working with in Lubbock. And what they do is they track playas, which are small bodies of water that act as natural. I think I have an image here. Yeah, that's a playa there outside of a city, right? I love this image too. It sort of sets the dichotomy of the High Plains in perfect focus in a lot of ways. So just as Anna was talking about this kind of alteration of the landscape, via mass use by people. Same thing on the high plains, right? They're just trying to farm everywhere possible. But it's a huge misunderstanding of that landscape because actually there are tons of wetland spots all over the high plains. And these playas, sometimes they're salinas, they have a higher salt content. They're really responsible for a huge amount of recharge into the aquifer. And so what playas are is they're actually a totally different type of clay, type of earth matter, and they're connected directly to the aquifer underneath. Now, the aquifer is not like a big ocean, so you shouldn't think of it like that, but these operate as almost like suction cups and straws that help sort of pull water back into the aquifer. And you can see, of course, in the image on the top, we've been completely ignoring the presence of the living earth below what we want to do with it. And so in this project, we worked with GIS maps, and we started thinking about how can we swap thinking about landscape into thinking about waterscape. And so what we did is, we went through all the water data maps, and these sort of move through and animate, but all the lighter colors start to sort of brighten up on these video projections, which there's 3 of them, you can sort of see them here. And those we put into a show in Santa Fe that also involved kind of sort of removing a water pump from a well that was originally farm workers. It would have been a camp at the beginning that turned into a small village. We were connected to this space both because of the water and socially. Partly because in some of our families out here, they were started. If you go back, they stop when you hit the orphan train. And or if you don't know about the orphan trains, there were tons of kids, homeless kids on the East Coast, and they were sent out by train to work on farms in the middle of the country. And so we sort of excavated this pump. It had been through a few transitions, but we sort of updated it. I'm going to try to move a little faster here. I'm sorry. So it gives you a little idea of some of the physical work that we create. And then the other part of the practice is sort of research-based and then highly collaborative within the areas that we're working with. I used landlines to sort of illustrate that work. And where we are here is in southern Colorado, between the Sangre de Cristo Mountains and the San Juans. There you can see on the bottom kind of what the valley looks like. A couple quick diagrams showing you kind of where we are in terms of, that star is Denver, so that's kind of the space where we're working. Critical place in terms of water. This is called the People's Ditch, and it's actually irrigation permit number 1. It is the oldest irrigation spot in the state of Colorado, and these date back to pre-statehood. And what you see on the left is called the Vega or the Commons, and it was a 600-acre site. It's a little smaller now, but it's one of the only agricultural commons still left in the U.S. And it's preserved because of these early land grants that were developed when Colorado became a state, that were set forth. So mostly ditch irrigation in the valley, and obviously the Rio Grande is the big sort of lifeline that runs through that space. All the way through New Mexico down to Texas. So what we do in this type of work is collaborate strongly with people who know what they're talking about. When we don't, right? So we love geology, but we're not geologists. So we worked with Andrew Valdez, who helped us to show his presentation of LiDAR 3D mapping of the entire valley, which was really great, an experimental way to think about geography. we worked with Jessica Kokoska, who's a playwright, to work in the community of Creed. And she created a piece that was about what it's like to be a mother and and be pregnant and have a child in this small place of Creed and trying to get to a place to safely have that child. So that's the contribution that Jessica made, and we paired that with FSA photos, which we often do in the work. Peggy Godfrey is a poet, and so we worked with her to include poems in the project. We worked with Christopher O'Brien, who's been in the Valley for a long time. Hotspots in the UFO GAP project. So everything from sort of UFO sightings, which you see here. There's a place in the Valley called the UFO Watchtower, which again is a great roadside kind of stop. And then we also, of course, do our own field trips and create field guides within this type of work, which is kind of what you see here. Oftentimes going to places that might not be on the beaten path, so to speak. This is one of those. For example, Christy Duran is from the Valley, and she's now a biologist that's working in Denver, and she helped show us to a place called La Botica, or the pharmacy. And the Valley, of course, pre-settlement was always a nomadic space. And La Botica is thought of, the pharmacy is this place that's full of medicinal plants. And so she, very knowledgeable with that, worked with the photographer, and they went and documented. We sort of expose some of these things without letting the secrets go too, because it's important that people don't know where it is, right? But it's been used, for thousands of years, really, that space. So those are the kinds of things that we're excited about. We're in the studio. We're really committed to a kind of multi-centered perspective. So we brought in Elliot Ross, who's the photographer. He spent 4 weeks in the Valley doing a little bit more work, both engaged with the community, but also trying to capture a bit of sort of the daily life in the Valley. And then where I'm going to end here is at the headwaters of the Rio Grande. It is an amazing place. It's a life force. If you go there, you absolutely will understand why it needs protected. And of course, there's all these, all the politics that start from there all the way down, which we tend to stay away from, quite honestly. So this is how the Landlands Project ends up. We work through publications quite a lot. You can find them at m12studio.org, shamelessly plugging those. Our publications, we like to, so we make field recordings. We invite people to come in to make recordings. In this book, there are 3 flexi discs that are bound inside that can be played on a turntable. One of them is To Watch, which is the name of a county and a town in the Valley where Dylan came and spent some time. Raven Chacon, who's an amazing Native American composer, also created a sound piece that's available in the book. So here's just an example. This is where you can mostly find our work, because it's out in the world, but it's, as you see, it sort of exists, and we document it, and where it kind of tends to end up is in publications. And we also collaborate with the Nevada Museum of Art on a small archive there at their Center for Art and Environment. The other place you can find us is in Big Springs, Nebraska. It's actually population 394 now, so that's only in a decade. So you can imagine how the numbers are going down. Of course, we're seeing outward population trends for forever in these communities. So in Big Springs, we help to operate a small hotel where we host summer research residencies, and then we have a very, very small shop where we hold our books, and we have small, we usually have a small exhibit up, and so that's where you can find us. And thank you very much for your time. I hope it's helpful in some way to your conversations there about your region. Thank you.
well on Anna's presentation because you're talking about these metaphorical installations that really embody the kind of historical collective memories that she's talking about. And I'd like to move to the present now by inviting Ted. Is Ted here? Yes. Ted is going to come and be a live person in front of us, and he will tell us a little bit about what's going on in our region right now. The Catskills is a place of transition. There are many grants and also many people who don't have much of anything. So come on over, and is this okay, or do you want to stand there?
I can probably just
you want to
invite
just
you.
project?
Do you have my presentation on your machine?
Well, let's see. Nikki, is this what's happening? What is happening? This is your computer, right?
This is your computer, yeah, it should be totally fine to go. You don't have to do anything.
Okay, so where is it?
Yeah, what is your presentation?
Ted's presentation.
Oh, I don't know, that's your computer.
I brought my computer, I can plug it in.
Oh, yeah, if you can.
Yeah, that might be easier, because I'm not sure. But this has all these plugs inside. Is that going to need to go into his computer? Okay. Oh, while you're doing that, I will look.
Yeah, just don't close this.
Oh, I don't want to
It should
actually.
stay there.
It should just stay there.
And what is it, like a $20 million project or something?
Thank you all for your patience with my being old and not understanding technology. I am so grateful to all of you for making this possible. And we don't need this in this.
Have you two been in the art center?
Oh, no, we do.
All right, well, thanks, Nancy. All right, well, this is going to land us like in the nuts and bolts world pretty quickly. I'm Ted Sharon, I'm an architect. My office is split between New York City and Arkville, where I have my studio up here. And I've been up here for about 15 years. So what I can give you is a kind of a snapshot of things I've been working on. And so my intent is not to show you a portfolio of work, but talk a little bit about what I see happening, and talk a little bit about what an architect's strategy is to deal with some of these issues that Nancy or Anna in particular brought up. Because I do think about, there is a real tension here, a historical tension and a current tension that does have to do with the city and the country. It has to do with people whose families have been here for a long time and who built the structures that I end up working with, as compared to people like me who have not been around here for very long and are inclined to change things. I will say, on a positive note, my sense is that in the last 10 years, things are getting fixed up a lot more than they're falling apart up here, and that's not what it was like in the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s. Things were definitely going to pieces, just lack of investment and lack of capital and lack of funding to fix things up. So, when I arrived in Arkville, I really had no work up here. I just bounced around and kept my ears open, and so this is what has happened. The yellow dots on this are public or commercial projects. The red dots are private residential projects. And the private residential projects are almost all art studios or art-related spaces.
Oh, did I do something? Oh.
And they're scattered about. I think the more important thing to talk about are the yellow projects. So these are projects that are actually having an effect on the public and the communities up here. So what I found is that we have 3 or 4 major trends going on with the public projects. We have breweries, which is all good. We have art galleries, so we have like that kind of you could say that like the tip of the gentrification spear, or often it's food, it's entertainment, it's art that kind of leads its way in areas that have not had a lot of investment in them in the past. And so the art projects, the art galleries are the 1053 Gallery in Fleischmann's. Food and alcohol is the Weaver Hollow Brewery in Andes. And the Print House in Fleischmann's. Then an interesting development also is there is the railroad. And the Delaware and Ulster Railroad gets funding from a variety of sources. And so what they do is they've got the Arkville train station. They run the train up to Halcottsville. And there's the potential to expand that to taking it up to Roxbury, which would be great. And the Delaware and Ulster Railroad, they get their funding from a variety of funding sources, like the O'Connor Foundation. And then we've got the downtown redevelopment initiatives. So this is state money that comes into towns where towns can get together. They get people talking. They determine what they'd like to do with their towns, how they can improve them, and they apply to the state for grants. And I mean, maybe you all know this, but Roxbury and Grand Gorge got a big one a couple years ago, $10 million. And this year, Margaretville, Arkville are getting together to try to do the same thing there. So as an architect, my strategy there is you go into the towns where people are talking about what they want to do and how they want to improve the towns, and you help them develop their projects, and you just kind of do it for free. It's fun, it's for a good cause, and it makes their presentations to the state a lot stronger, which is good, because the state wants to give money to people who have real projects and plans and thought about energy conservation and how to preserve the character of the area. From an aesthetic standpoint, what I think is the best approach up here and is kind of necessary is work with the existing context. You want to accept the existing character and fabric of the place, as quirky and eccentric as it is, and try to do insertions that are good design, good materials, energy efficient, where you're kind of looking to the future. You're making it better, but you're also not losing those traces of the past. I think this is a good strategy because it's much less rough on the land, uses less energy, and kind of keys into that collective memory idea that Anna talked about. So I'll just flip through a few of these, and you can see whether or not the strategy works. It's up to you. So this is in Fleischmann's. This is 1053 Main Street before any improvements to it. This was a building that was a department store for a while, has apartments above it. And the idea is you keep the existing structure, and what I wanted to do with this client who has done several projects in Fleischmann's is try to create the most inviting, kind of glowing box to get you in there, get people looking into the space, draw them into the space. And so I don't have a lot of photos, but you leave the existing shell, leave the brick, completely clean out the inside, put really good lighting in there, and you really open it up to kind of draw the eye in and sort of get people in off the street. And you want this thing to glow because this dead streets with nothing going on behind the windows is terrible. The more of that light you can get in there, the better. This then led to the Print House across the street, and now there's a commercial building next to that that's also getting redeveloped. So Fleischmann's is really kind of popping in this little knot of Main Street. This is another project, unrealized, but in the works. This is also in Fleischmann's. This is one of the few existing leftover kind of resort-type buildings. It was known as the Evergreen for a while, and it's been vacant for years. Mark Bierman, who is doing a lot of this development work in Fleischmann's, he's really committed to fixing up the town, and he was behind the gallery project. So again, the strategy here is look at what's there, and then how can we change it to update it completely, and again, make it glow, make it more inviting, bring people in, get people to come down from High Mount and the ski hills to get in there, have a drink, stay over, but retain the memory of the place by essentially keeping the geometry that was there. So just add and embellish what's there. So this is the Arkville train station. They, like I said, have plans to improve the facility. They've just started a kind of rolling restaurant in the trains that's being run by Mornings, which is another small business in Arkville. I encourage you all to check it out. But the railroad actually has a really fantastic Pullman car that's a historical piece of railroad history in New York, and we're beginning to think about a way to display that as part of the train tour. So we'd essentially, that's the original Arkville station. This is looking east, and there's a second station that was there for freight that's gone. So we thought we'd kind of replicate that and bring it back, and try to make a space for the to display this train. So here are the tracks. That's the existing station that's getting fixed up now. This would be new over here, and again we'd replicate the geometry of the old building, but put this Pullman car in there as a kind of feature. Again, you want people to see into this, slow down, stop the car, get out of the car, have some fun and kind of learn about the town. Again, probably a ways off, but you got to start somewhere. And this is also Delaware and also Railroad County project. This is probably my favorite one, actually. They're turning their rails into trails, and this means that the old railroad bridges need to be made safe for people on horseback, snowmobiles, and hikers. So this takes the same strategy. We keep the bridge, keep the structure, clean the steel up, but insert this new set of rails and a new platform for people to walk on, and you've kind of got the old and the new working together. And that's kind of a close-up of it that sort of captures it. Put the new structure right on top of the existing structure. Keep it kind of rough, don't make it too slick, because this is not a super slick part of the world. Use local materials where you can, and leave the old stuff. Let the old concrete be visible, let the old steel be visible, and then people can kind of put this together as they use it. And that's it.
Thank you so much. That was great. Do you all want to have a few minutes for discussion at this point? Are you guys feeling chatty? I kind of would like to start. There's only the two of us in this panel,
Okay.
so maybe if you want to sit for a second. Heather, are you here?
She went outside.
Oh, okay. Well, we'll just sit here.
Want some lights on?
Yeah, could you?
Okay.
Yeah, give us a little light. So I
I'd
have.
like to have some, oops, sorry.
Oh, what? Okay, I'm not sure if this is on. Not sure if this is working. Okay, we'll just project. I wanted to ask you guys some questions because one of my impulses to create this event, really several years ago, was because Prattsville tried to have a town planning process to put forward one of these Main Street grants and things like that. And it really wasn't possible because people in this kind of rural community who have been here for a long time, their forte seemed to be solving immediate problems. And so I went to one of the Roxbury meetings with the Grand Gorge community. Some of my interns went with me, And people were asking them, well, what do we need for this $10 million grant? And people thought, maybe that pothole at the corner should be fixed, which is true, it's real. And I mean, people who come from a farming background, I think their thought is, there's a storm coming, we have to get the cows in. There's something happening that we need to run out and cover the plants. This is a real way of thinking, but it's not the kind of thinking that is abstract and proposes something that doesn't yet exist. It's more of an iterative, reactive kind of planning. And so I think there's an interesting discussion that can happen between someone who's working in the community, but bringing ideas from around the world to a place, and yet respecting the needs of the people who are already there. And I think this is a community where that is happening organically. But what I saw was we were able to stop a Dollar General, which, in case you don't know, that's really hard. And Peter and his partner were there banging on the table saying, go home, go home. And that was pretty exciting. And then we also stopped a huge trash recycling plant that was going to bring trash from Albany and all these other areas up the mountain to burn it and then send it in pellet form to Europe. Very energy efficient. So we didn't really think that was a good plan, especially since it was right next to the reservoir. So we put together panels, people organized, and we stopped it. So people here know how to deal with a crisis. What they don't know how to deal with is an empty space. And I feel like it would be really great to start some kind of conversation where people aren't just complaining about what they see or what they don't see immediately, but where people are really, envisioning what could be. And so I really wanted to bring you all here to talk about that. And I think Anna's discussion of the history of the region, there is an enormous amount of bitterness between rural and urban communities. And they are very connected. And actually, it's great to have you, Ted, because very little of these discussions actually comes up this far into the mountains. Most of it is really the Delaware County Valley, where there was a lot of farming. But here, we do have some farms, and we used to have 200 dairy farms in Prattsville. And, that was after the tannery. We pivoted. We became a dairy farming community. There was a slaughterhouse. There was a trucking company. All of these associated things. But agribiz wiped that out the same way, go big or go home. That was Eugene Debs, our, person who decided all this. And everyone went along. So I want to know from you, or I want to, talk together about what you see as possibilities. Do you feel like these first three presentations have given you some inspiration? I mean, do you have any questions for the participants? Yes, Lynn.
It's a question for all of the participants, and it addresses what you're saying, because what this brought up for me in the presentations and what is always present, I live in Lexington, which is only 10 miles away, and I'm wondering, how do communities think about, not so much, although it's real also, the rural-urban divide, but now that there are more urbanites in the rural places, and that is part of what is sparking this new envisioning, and it's creating its own tension. So what is the thinking, collective memory, strategy between the historic people of the region at this moment in the Catskills, in places like Fleischmann's, Arkville, Margaretville, Lexington, Prattsville, Roxbury, and the historic people that have always been there, and the newer people who are kind of interlopers, gentrifiers, whatever we're called. I mean, and I've been here 25 years, or had something here 25 years, and still feel like somewhat of a new person compared to the people who have been here. All the projects that you're talking about. Is that a question or is that clear?
Was that me?
Anna, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear what you said.
It
Was
doesn't-
someone else?
No, it's fine. Anna, you can speak.
Okay, fantastic. I think that's such a good point. And, that puzzle is part of why I have spent the last 8 years researching this, because I think there are, first of all, these really, clear delineated boundaries that people establish. So you sort of framed it as the historic community and as you described yourself, interlopers. I have heard people use the phrase newcomers. That has taken a slightly different tone in the last few decades. I've heard in some of the older conversations, folks use the term come-heres. And actually, I found a fantastic oral history from the 1970s. And I've been in the process of digitizing oral histories and returning them to Delaware County. And so this will eventually be available for folks. But there's a woman who's a dowser, I believe, has lived for a long time in Delaware County, and she's talking with her interviewer and laughing, and she says, I've lived here 30 years and I'll never be a local. And so part of what I think you're getting at is this sense of division between a quote-unquote local and a quote-unquote newcomer or new arrival or part-timer or whatever the term of the day is. And I think it's a really difficult puzzle because, of course, every group of people, every small community within a larger community is going to have its own, you might say, vibe, its own sense of history, its own set of memories, and its own opinions, and those can't be sort of simply grouped into one. But I think the large pattern, even though individual people, their friendships, their work, and their lives cross that boundary all the time, there is still a certain kind of efficacy and usefulness in thinking about that divide because people invest in it so much. People continue to identify as outsiders for decades or to be identified as outsiders, whether they want that or not. And so I think the real puzzle is thinking about how folks who have belonged to and remained intergenerationally rooted in, for this conversation, the Catskills, but really for any place where you have this dynamic, is to think about collaboration across that as always rooted in the larger conversations and patterns that are often not apparent to someone who hasn't had as deep a family or personal history in a place. So I did a number of ethnographic interviews in my research, and something that I heard from a lot of different people, including, in one case, a farmer who had lived 60 years in the region, and he had not heard about the reservoirs except in a few passing references until the 1990s. And then in this moment of crisis over the regulation, people began to talk about it again, and that gave him a new perspective on the region and its history. So this is to say that even someone who has lived in a place a long time can, in many ways, become a local and yet not know certain things. And so always sort of starting from a place, if you understand yourself as an outsider, starting from a place of listening and asking questions instead of saying, I am coming here as an expert and I have this guidance for you. Instead, first listening and saying, what is the middle ground where we can collaborate after listening? So I hope that's helpful. This is a big puzzle for the world and for the Catskills.
It's true. I think these questions don't exist just here, and I'm really excited that we can be here at the apex of the Catskill Mountains, where to one side we have New York City, you can view that, and to the other side we have the entire stretch of the Midwest and rural communities across America, which are struggling with all these same issues, and it's so interesting to have this sort of kaleidoscope of people together. I think that there is something really difficult that new people do bring, but there are also really positive things I think that newer people can bring. I think Ted's work is a really good example of that because he has this kind of respect for the old, but also has, the knowledge of how to listen and get things to work. And I also want to ask Peter Perrone to speak to this because he's been here a long time. And Peter, I think you've contributed something really special to this community, and I wondered if you could speak to that.
Well, you know what? I've been here 33 years as a part-timer, and I was talking to my friends here that before the flood, I think my experience here was to come up on the weekends, bring my New York City friends, have my New York City bubble, and then we'd go back. The flood changed that in so many ways in that it opened the entire community to the disaster. And so for about a year, suddenly people were either in your houses or you were in their houses, who you kind of saw the supermarket, but you were very, very different, culturally and otherwise. And unfortunately, that kind of magic, compassionate energy waned after a couple of years, don't you think? And so that sort of openness closed back up again. But when you're talking about history and farming, I also see another thing which is creating a divide, and it's not so much about upstate, downstate, but it's kind of cultural, religious values that have happened in the community, and it's become more of them and us quality on many levels, as you know personally from dealing with certain performances here at the Art Center about how other members of the community would review that because it affronted their idea of morality. So it's not just an agricultural, farming, upstate, downstate thing. There are real issues that are about where we are now as an entire culture here in New York and also in the nation. That one can hope will create bridges, because that's the idea that I have. Let's not do walls with bridges, but it's quite difficult, and I think that she mentioned something really important, is that you have to come in and first of all listen and open up and take in information and then maybe suggest something. But did you have any specific things you wanted to ask me, Nancy, that you thought I might have some?
Well, I think you kind of suggested what I was going after, which is I think the presence of, openly queer people in the community has been really, really important, and I think it has allowed a certain level of freedom for people who maybe wouldn't feel empowered to walk by the tavern, to walk down Main Street. And I know people have told me that since the Art Center has been here on Main Street that they feel safer. And Charlie, I would like to ask you if you would like to say something about your experience of the divide that you are kind of in the middle of, because in some ways the next generation is a blending of these two kinds of experiences.
Yeah, so building off what you said, growing up, especially being transgender in this area has been, it's a lot of alienation, a lot of feeling ostracized from your community. So having that sense of, community has been really helpful, and also being younger, it's people think oh, hey, you don't know what you're talking about yet, you're so young, you have so much time left to figure out who you are, what you are, all of that sort of all that sort of thing. And it's I don't know, having the Art Center here and having resources similar to the Art Center is another situation where it's hey, I feel safe walking down the street or whatever. It's definitely helpful to have those sorts of resources in the area, and not just for me, but just for queer people as a whole, because there's not a lot of those resources, not just in Prattsville, but just in this general area. The Catskills are a very tight-knit community, but not in the way where they're going to be super open to accepting new people.
Mm-hmm. So some of the new people that may be struggling with acceptance are not necessarily new to the region. They're people who've grown up in the region in some cases. But yeah, Anna?
I'd love to add something there, because I'm sorry, who was the person who was just speaking before you, Nancy? I couldn't hear your name.
Charlie is an intern at the Art Center and now in college in Kew.
And what's their name?
Charlie.
Charlie. That was what I was trying to hear. So I wanted to respond to something that Charlie said about being a trans person or a queer person in a rural community, because I think this sort of tension it's something I've experienced myself and something that I think it gets to one of the contradictions of the way that small, close-knit communities are romanticized, and part of the tension around the sort of who is a newcomer, who belongs, what does it take to belong or not belong in a community. So there's a Catskills-based sociologist who wrote a fantastic book in 1990, Janet Fitchin, and she writes about how certain people who have the same kinds of family roots that go back generations in a place can be externalized by sort of culturally dominant members of that community in ways that cast them as non-local and not belonging. And I think that she's writing particularly about poverty in Delaware County, as well as several other counties outside the watershed that she studied. But I think queerness and gender nonconformity or being transgender are also things where in many rural communities they are treated as markers that make someone cast as not a local. And that is one of the contradictions that people imagine often, this so romanticized sort of continuous intergenerational community that may be extremely tight-knit and close, but part of that intimate, consistent sense of belonging is based very often, historically, on a certain amount of sort of rigid conformity and sort of narrow boundaries of who is included. And I think that finding ways to open that up without casting people who don't fit as outsiders, even within their own communities, is something that is so important and like a really generative space. And so I'm really excited to be in this conversation today.
Thank you so much, Anna. So on the idea of generative space, I think the idea of creating a space for different communities, different generations, different histories to come together is something that is really exciting to talk about with architects. You know, and I can see the kinds of buildings that Ted is putting together as being a space where someone from the older, you know, kind of communities might scratch their head and say, well, why does it look that way? But then this part I'm familiar with. And similarly, someone coming from the city might say, oh, that looks like a storefront that I'm familiar with, but then it has all these old, you know, sort of patinaed surfaces, which might not exist in, you know, an urban environment. And I think that these contradictions can be embodied in architecture and in spaces. And I think our next panel is actually really well prepared to deal with that. So I would really like to invite you to, does anyone have a last question or two that you would like to share before we move to the next panel? Okay, well, thank you so much. Yes.
Yeah, one quick thing. Just it's so interesting to hear Charlie talk about the space of this space, the Prattsville Art Center, and to hear Ted talk about the kind of this social space, and you know, just something as seemingly simple as a bridge, evoked through material.
Yeah.
Just creates this idea about space that can be either catalytic for different communities. Maybe the art center might sometimes, and we're total newcomers to this, so I'm going to speak wildly out of turn and out of line. But it's maybe, I would imagine, sometimes it might be divisive, and other times collective. And I think that these, what Ted's doing in these spaces with this work that's in the public realm, and your identification with this space, is just super interesting for this conversation about. Let's say civicness in an urban, in a rural condition, in a rural place.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll
just
talk
as a way
about
to add to that, I think this idea of placemaking, that's the question. Like, what is everyone's version of a sense of place and belonging, whether you're a newcomer or someone? So I think that's a really interesting question from a community standpoint, from an architectural standpoint, and Ted, just responding to your work, just that creating a sense of place that creates a sort of hybrid of that knitting together that you're talking about, Nancy.
Yeah, and also just like you've plugged into these, also the processes, like the processes of these grants, which I think is fantastic. I agree with all that, except for I don't think you should be working for free.
Yeah, I wish money had nothing to do with it. But I do think in terms of like the placemaking aspect of it, it's the success of a place like this one or the gallery in Fleischmann's, a lot of it, it'd be nice if architecture could solve all these problems. You really, from an aesthetic standpoint, it's kind of a fool's errand to think you can kind of design cooperation in people and do it, with your great vision of what it should be. However, it's, architectural work and construction is intrinsically optimistic. You're building something.
Right.
And I think there's as much impact by just doing a project
Right.
and getting people kind of roped into it than there is to kind of what it looks like in the end, or whether or not it's published or like noted by other architects even. One way to get people to become insiders is work together on something, and buildings take a lot of people, a lot of time, and they have to work together on them. So if you can kind of rig that process a little bit, and it's hard as an architect because you're not hiring the workers, but you're in there with the contractors and the contractors' employees, and a good number of them are insiders. They are not, like me, someone who's been here for 15 years. So I don't know. You try to infiltrate that, and I think there's a value in just in doing more projects and fixing things up, because people of any stripe, when they see things getting improved, it's hard not to recognize it. It's also hard not to recognize somebody taking pride in the way their front yard looks, or the way their facade looks, or the fact that their windows aren't broken. All those little incremental things, in the long run, I think do help people to kind of get over some of these differences.
Yeah, totally. And you're just you and what you do and your identification of those projects. Like, I know that Pullman car.
Right.
And if that's just sitting there for a long time and broken down, then, like you said, it radiates into the community. If you choose to get involved with that, then that has, it's a ripple effect. It's really great. It helps that it's beautiful design.
Well, that is a perfect transition to invite our next panelists. So I don't have the schedule. Does anyone have the schedule? Thank you. Ooh, I have more. I just.
And the county fairgrounds, which we'll be talking about today, as an indispensable national resource.
And just before we proceed, I want to make sure that you can see behind us, that we're not blocking this deck. So our research reveals old and new opportunities for architecture and the history of rural culture, emphasizing infrastructures that are mobile, deployable, or temporary, that operate across humanitarian and cultural spaces. So our current project tracks the movement of education and entertainment in rural American history and the spatial outcomes of these systems. So we recognize the convergence of education, entertainment, and technology as sites like the county fairgrounds. So today there are over 3,000 fairgrounds across America that continue to host the convergence of agriculture, education, and spectacle every summer. There are civic infrastructures that are in disguise. And through the programming that transforms the fairground year-round, they continue to be sites of American state building, most deeply cultivated through the youth organization 4-H.
So the last major study of the county fairgrounds as an architectural typology was done by the geographer Fred Niffen in 1949. And while the fair has long been recognized for its cultural significance, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the county fair, been to them, or at least understand that there's this event that happens every year. Its spatial logic, like how it's laid out, what is the typology, that type of history is really fundamentally understudied. So Fred Niffen, this geographer, is one of the people that we are really leaning on a lot here and picking up on his history. So just to kind of quickly maybe go over a little bit of the formal development before we show you some examples, is up in the top left-hand corner. That little diagram, what it's really showing is that in the beginning of the county fair, what would become the county fair, which was the agricultural fair at the time, there would be a spot for a church, some type of religious activity, and then a spot for the sharing of agricultural knowledge. So it's not the fair that we think of it today. But what comes next in the second one down in 1840, that thing, the big track, so that is a horse racing track. And what is really important here is like now we've lost, the church. It's maybe embedded in some way, but we're talking about agricultural education, and we're talking about racing or, spectacle, or some type of, sport or, what do I want to say, entertainment. So what's important though about that second diagram is that square around the fair, that's the fair, and that was the space that was understood as the educational space. The track, the horse track, that was understood as the vice, basically. Outside of it, it had to be something different. There was betting going on. There were things going on there that somehow did not mesh with the fair itself or with the purpose of the agricultural fair. And then lastly, 1860. This is where we get the model that we're more familiar with now, especially in the eastern side of the Midwest and in New York. And that's where the racetrack comes inside of the fair. Okay, and so what happens in this moment is this is where we get education, we get racing, and we get entertainment all inside of the county fairgrounds. And so this is when like the midway starts, and we have these games, various entertainment-like things that are happening there. But Fred Niffen and his study, 1949, he basically concludes that the peak age of the fair is essentially past. But in reality, we all know that the county fair has continued on, and the county fairground is still there in a lot of instances. And so, we're interested in how this thing has really transformed and responded to contemporary society. And so we'll just quickly go through some examples here to show you just a visual for like typologies of county fairs around the country. So where we have the horse track, it's still very active. These are a couple from Ohio, and then the fair surrounding it. Okay, and go ahead.
Oh yeah, and then here we're looking at essentially layered infrastructure. So this was an existing park, and here we see the county fairground right in the middle where you see the horse track. And then again, we have another case where there is an existing airport here, and the county fair is right next to it. So here's the airport, and then the county fair.
Something else that has emerged in the late 20th century is the car track instead of the horse track. So as M12 had pointed out earlier, like the racing of cars or even the demolition derby, this thing has become kind of a central organizational feature of county fairgrounds out in Kansas, like where we're at right now, which do not have horse tracks anymore. It's not a popular thing. They're really interested in the rodeo, and the car track has taken over as the major organizational feature. Here's another example with the rodeo just above the car track. Yeah, right there. And the additional thing that we're adding to this diagram from Fred Niffen on the next slide is what we're calling the ghost track. So in places where horse racing has fallen to the side, people aren't interested in it, it's just really not part of the culture, that original track still really defines the spatial organization of the county fairgrounds. So here we have a good example of a ghost track in Kansas. I think the next one has one that is kind of really starting to deteriorate, but it's still a very important aspect of how it's organized. And here we have one in Salina, Kansas, that has essentially become an event center for central and western Kansas. The kind of other thing that we really want to say about the county fair itself is that these are not really just like passive backgrounds of the county fairgrounds themselves. Of course the county fair is happening, but that's only like 1 to maybe 2 weeks out of the year. So they've also been sites of a really amazing convergence of agriculture, art, and then at this time mechanization. So they've been spaces, and these are all old, late 19th century, early 20th century examples, but this still holds true today of demonstration grounds for new technology. So we have windmills in Kansas in the late 1800s. We have a locomotive demonstration of a push-off, essentially. This is the beginning of the demolition derby. we also have, this interesting convergence with the beginning of aviation. So there were lots of demonstration acts with balloons before we had airplanes. And then finally, this was the first place that people were seeing airplanes for the first time. So even the infield of the horse track became a landing field. So we have this really nice, on the next page I think, postcard from Iola, Kansas. My first glimpse of an airplane. So this is, a grounds that is really kind of demonstrating the state of the art as far as technology goes, as far as mechanization of agriculture goes. And so here again, flyovers that are happening and this demonstration of technology. Maybe I'm sure maybe a lot of you are familiar with the Chautauqua, but this adult educational, mobile traveling circuit was being popped up at the county fairgrounds as well. And then, as we mentioned earlier, one of the really important things that's happening in the late 20th century or mid 20th century is the development of 4-H. And so here we have essentially the education of youth in rural communities and kind of an understanding of the youth being, utilized as infrastructure in this way, which we're not be talking about here, but it's a fascinating history to get into.
Oh,
Go ahead.
you're not missing anything?
Oh, no, so,
Agrarian futurism?
go for it.
Okay, so what these patterns really are pointing to is what we call agrarian futurism, which essentially what we're labeling it as is an architecture of civil life that's embedded in ritual and open to reinvention. So now we're going to move on to our next chapter, which is the method, so how we actually go about documenting. So as we mentioned, Fred Niffen, he really emphasized that vernacular landscapes, especially buildings, spatial patterns, and settlement forms are among the most revealing records of cultural history. Yet county fairgrounds have some of the most layered rural sites have rarely been documented. So no central archives, and what survives is often anecdotal, promotional, and incomplete. So this project uses orthomosaic maps, mapping to address that gap. So drone captured and photo geometry stitches, which produce high resolution georeference images, and they create measurable maps. And so by looking closely at the county fairgrounds, we can learn to design with flexibility, with memory, and with the knowledge that's already embedded in these sites. So this is just an image of one of our days on site. And what this method captures is change, shifts in use, additions, losses. It extends architectural's long-standing relationship with documentary photography into spatial analysis, so essentially producing maps that can be archived, compared, and studied over time. And what you see here is essentially point cloud and the mesh model. And what the result is essentially a new record, one that fuses vernacular typology with forensic mapping, advancing Niffen's vision through contemporary tools collaborated to track transformation. And essentially what you see is a real measurable map. So these are the snippets. So the next project, we are happy to share, we've recently been commissioned to design a new county fairground, which will be known as the Flint Hills Event Center, just outside of Manhattan, Kansas. And the previous grounds were located within Seco Park in Manhattan, Kansas. So while centrally located, the site faced major constraints. Essentially, there was just not enough barns and not enough space on the site to actualize the future of the site. And so we've been hired to design the relocation and essentially produce the new future of the ground. So what you see here is what our own footage, what we droned. So this is the 40 acres that will be developed over the next couple of years. And this is essentially one of our orthomosaic maps.
Right. So they basically have just run out of space, and the fairgrounds in Riley County, that's where we're located, just really does not represent the extent of the agricultural community there. So it's an expansion, the city wants that part of the park back, and so it's a great opportunity here to lean into what lessons we've learned from studying the county fairgrounds. And really the thing that is kind of amazing that you've probably experienced is the way that all of the spaces in between the barns get activated. So we're proposing a clustered design proposal here that really activates the space in between the barns as more of a public space. And so if we go to the next one, you can see that we're talking about barns that have a proximity between the two, that take advantage of these spaces instead of just leaving them left over and activating them in a certain way, but finding new ways to do this. Additionally, we are looking at utilizing fabric materials, so like nylon, so that they do glow at nighttime, so that ventilation is stronger, and so that even inside of an amazing barn, getting more light inside of this thing. So the barns have a shared language here. So there's a low slung roof. They're long span structures. The county fair board is really wanting this to be a extremely flexible space. And so the reason why it's called the Riley the Flint Hills Event Center is just the observation that the county fair happens 1 week out of the year. And we have this huge piece of property, infrastructure, buildings that could be activated so much more. So they're huge long span structures. They have flexible materials for the garages, garage door openings, and we're really trying to rethink the barn here as far as what its material applications are, its lighting qualities on the inside, and looking at this thing as a space that can be adapted and utilized for various agricultural fairs and various uses throughout the year, so that it does become a public community resource that is not just utilized by the fair. And they have big dreams, so some of our imagery for this is looking at what the potential of this thing is as far as the fair goes. But it's just a different mentality about leaning into the fact that this is a incredible community resource that does get utilized, but really trying to plan for a future site like this that would help facilitate the community to grow and really, in their minds, become this epicenter of knowledge exchange, and agriculture in eastern Kansas.
Also, you should know that you're the first public eyes to see this project, so congrats. Okay, so the next project is actually one that we've been working together for a couple of years, but this has been the precursor to the county fair project that we just talked about, the Flint Hill Center. So it's called Super Sites, which proposes a deployable national infrastructure capable of responding to crises, both climatic and cultural, with the speed and adaptability the permanence cannot afford. So in the U.S. infrastructure, infrastructure has long signaled decline, and since the 1980s, systems have deteriorated while response remains slow, heavy, and expensive. And at the same time, social, technological, and political change continues to accelerate at unmatched speeds. And so SuperSites rejects the paradigm of permanence. It offers a national infrastructure that embraces impermanence and is defined by deployability, quick builds, tailored wraps, and smart disassembly architecture that becomes a flexible kit of parts that requires the architect to be as concerned with building as they are with debuilding. And so really the tractor is the central actor on the ground, a hybrid machine whose role changes through attachments with different implementations. So what you see here is essentially our kit that will continue to develop depending on the implementation. So the project begins with a generalized system of a tent, tractor, masts, membranes, and ties, and evolves prototype by adapting these components to the demands of separate programs. So these test kits refine the prototype and establish a paradigm of adaptability in a flexible but not necessarily a generic way. And so in developing a sartorial architecture and reconsidering programs from disaster shelters to polling centers to traveling schools, SuperSites positions infrastructure as something that is capable of responding to both crisis of climate and culture. And I know that we're a little bit out of time, but we'll have this video on loop later. It's just 5 minutes, it's silent, and I mean, maybe we can watch. It basically walks you through the history, the construction. Maybe we can let it play for a few minutes if we are okay for time.
Should we talk about it?
I mean, we can talk about it.
Or I mean, just you know, this is just, it's talking about infrastructure in the U.S. And obviously the project that we're working on in Kansas right now is you know, permanent buildings, right, that have ideas of flexibility embedded in them. But Nikki and I are also very interested in reinvestigating the tent and trying to understand, you know, what else we can do with temporary architectures. So this is kind of just going through the county fairgrounds that we have documented around the country. So we've done a number of documentation projects, or documented a number of sites in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia, as well as Kansas now. So really, you know, respecting the original buildings that are there and trying to understand how might we, you know, not in the case of our project right now that actually is a redevelopment or a new project, but trying to think about systems and ways to you know, utilize the grounds that are around the country.
And we really are near the end. But here we're looking at the construction, which again, it's the masts, the sartorial techniques, and what you see is essentially the building. And we're almost at the end.
So we're really excited about you know, understanding the tractor as this hybrid machine that can do a lot more for us, and also, you know, tie back into the mechanization of construction. Essentially, when the tractor left the fields and came to the construction site in like the 1920s, and picking up on that history. But again, just a speculative project right now about how to utilize temporary structures and how to utilize this history of the tractor more significantly in architecture itself.
And really it's about resources, distributing them across the country and really tapping into the 3,030 sites that are available all across the country. That is all. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm David Levin,
And I'm Stella Betts.
and we have an architecture practice that's based in the other Apple, and in Columbia County.
Yeah.
We've been in practice for 28 years, and the basis of our practice has been in both urban and rural areas, and in sort of spaces in between. But currently is really focused on this civic work that's embodied in basically library institutions and cultural institutions that have been primarily in the New York City area. But we're developing a project called Civic out of our office that you see that's really beginning to look at these branch library systems outside of New York City and across all of New York State.
Yeah, and we
We're
were
gonna
just,
talk
I mean, Nancy, just the way you sort of framed this whole symposium was really so interesting to us, and already hearing the other presentations, because we've been looking at studying, teaching, researching libraries and building libraries for quite a while, and this idea of shared resources, that libraries, and what we're going to talk a lot about, which I'm sure many of you already know, is that libraries have changed so much in the last several decades, if not more, in terms of moving away from being a container of books. So this idea of shared resources is really a community center, which we're going to talk about. This idea of infrastructure, an infrastructure of community centers, an infrastructure of information and knowledge, but also a place for people to come. So this idea of placemaking that we were just talking about. And then this other, thinking about it from a kind of healthy and sustainable aspect. I think is something where that's the thread for us that I think is really, that we're excited to be participating in this conversation today.
And when Stella says healthy, we talk about the health of, it's gradated from the health of individuals, so material that go into buildings are health-based, or I should say more importantly, non-toxic, health of communities, and then health of the planet. And so this really is a project about health of communities, places for all people to come together in these spaces that are, as Stella said, no longer just, quote, just, houses for books, but they are for so many other uses, as well as they by necessity for us as architects, have to be decarbonized. We have to build in ways that are carbon positive. And so the project Civic really begins with this idea of rebuilding the branch library and for this discussion, let's say the rural branch library. We arrive at the project through these different modes of information that are fascinating to us, from recording information, human information, knowledge, storytelling on clay tablets, through to the Gutenberg printing press, different technologies of moving materials around buildings, and then in the bottom, behind me, ebooks, which that didn't just happen by itself. Sorry about this.
So I mean, just because in the interest of time and short presentations, I mean, not so much on the history of libraries, but understanding the kind of evolution of libraries from often being more private, that were, attached to either monasteries or more about the sort of nobility, and also because, books themselves were either one-offs or very few copies, and then with the sort of printing press. So that sort of history of libraries we've been fascinated with, but we're really focused mostly on the idea of the public library. So these are all the different, obviously, libraries that
These are sort of the grand libraries. This is actually this is our entree into libraries, but this is not what we're talking about today, and it's not what we're focusing on. It's really, this idea of the kind of the branch library is this more quotidian space.
Right, so looking more at local communities. So although we look in our practice and through this project of Civic at all types of libraries, we're mostly focused on branch libraries. And this really starts, which I think is the next slide, is the Carnegie. Yeah, it really, we're basing this project on Civic on the model, the Carnegie model, if you're familiar with the Scottish-American philanthropist who built not quite 2,000 libraries in the U.S., but also internationally, but specifically branch libraries in underserved communities. Yes, urban, here are some that are New York City, but these smaller libraries that are about their local communities. And I think that's something, this idea also, Nancy, in your sort of statement of framing this symposium, the idea of sort of bridging the rural and the urban. And I think what we find, I mean, we'll show you a couple of examples of the libraries that we do in the city, but the Project Civic is looking more towards the rural, but branch libraries are very specific to their communities. And I think that is really that sort of bridge or that intersection, because when you're talking about projects that are either in the city or rural, it's very much about the local community and the needs. And we're going to talk about how libraries change. When Carnegie, it was still very much a container of books. The revolutionary aspect of it was that the books were accessible. It was no longer librarians that you had to go request a book for, but you had access to it. We're talking about a different type of access that is evolved with the branch libraries that are well beyond books.
And even branch libraries, and the understanding that branch libraries are so critical in, this is 1972, 3, 4-ish, probably one of the toughest periods economically, socially, in New York City's history. But still, there was a very significant branch library constructing campaign under Mayor Lindsay. They were tough little buildings and they were not inviting, and they were starved for light. They served a purpose. And so this is really where we're at now, as we transition, as critically as Carnegie's transition from libraries as grand spaces to libraries where anybody could browse collections. Now we're arriving at a place where, yes, we're still doing that, but libraries become spaces for so many other things, and we're seeing this in our communities in New York City, and we're seeing this in rural communities across rural, suburban, exurban, whatever, across New York State. Libraries have to be so much more, and so they have to be these spaces where anybody can feel comfortable, and anybody might even can maybe not even check out a book, but could check out a lawnmower, or could libraries could serve as food pantries. And we're not making this up. The librarians are so far ahead of us right now. They're doing all of these things. We're just sort of trying to catch on, and then as architects, make healthy spaces for all these things to happen.
So, I mean, we're working on our 5th library in the city, and a lot of these programs are coming from all those different libraries, but each community of those 5 libraries have a different set of criteria of what's important to them. And I think that's the thread, and I think earlier there was a conversation about the importance of listening, and I think most of the work that we do with libraries is listening to communities. You know, the stakeholders, there are so many between community boards, that we meet with librarians, the sort of larger network of the library systems, and then through the local librarians, and meeting with the specific community in terms of what their needs are, with the importance of listening and understanding that different communities need different additional programs for their libraries. So that's really a lot of what we're talking about.
So interesting to hear about the numbers of fairgrounds.
Yeah.
You know, and understanding fairgrounds as an infrastructural system. Libraries, we see them as an infrastructural system as well.
And actually, you were talking very much about the idea of the fairgrounds as this sort of, you know, hidden civic. I think libraries definitely have more of a civic presence, but they also are kind of stealth in the sense of that you don't think of them as being as much about this sort of public civic space, but actually they are doing so much for the community, and especially the small branch libraries, they pack a real punch.
And then, you know, just looking at numbers, as we as architects and engineers like to do, there are 23 systems across the state, 23 different library systems, comprised of 765 buildings and that are also part of 1,100, you know, quote unquote outlets that are like bookmobiles, libraries and schools, different locations. So when we start to understand this magnitude of this system/systems, you know, we realize that there's a massive opportunity to create these types of spaces for these things to happen, and we're going to talk about carbon.
And just to kind of frame it a little bit, this Project Civic that we've been working on, we're just focusing on New York State. But for sure, it's a model for other areas of the country, but just because this is where we live and work, both in the city and in Columbia County, so we've been focusing that on New York State.
So this is the library near when we live upstate in Columbia County. And we find it to be fascinating. It's you know, kind of it's an incredibly adorable little building. But when you really start looking at it, even just from a surface standpoint, you know, it's using you know, petrochemical technology. It's using carbon-based technology for heating. It does provide accessibility. It talks about that, but it's pretty tricky. So access, you know, how it feels to get to this place for people of various abilities. And it also has as many of the libraries outside the city have, an amazing opportunities of space outside of the library if a community wants to expand or build completely new, decommission, or add to. So the opportunities of carbon and space and health, we think are kind of phenomenal. But then when we start to look at the systems themselves, these are what are called the municipal libraries. So they're funded by the state. They're initiated by the state and localities. Association libraries, as part of this 765, are libraries that are begun by, let's say, other organizations and then become funded by the state. So kind of thinking about your library here, pretty fascinating. And then this map, and this comes from New York State Library's website. These are unserved localities in New York State, places where there are no libraries. And so we just thought it'd be interesting to take a look at where around Prattsville, how far do you have to go to get to a library? And so Roxbury is the closest, that's 16 minutes, let's say 12 miles away. Wyndham that we just drove past, this is actually, if you know the church with the leaning steeple, it's on the backside of that building that we just realized on the drive over where it actually was. 12 miles away. This is in Hunter, a big grand space, 20 miles away. Margaretville, sort of a little library on the backside, 24 miles away. So, and then Palinville, which was in a sort of a little, almost a shed that then moved to this library. And actually Palinville is where we became interested in this civic project because we kept riding our bikes by the library and thinking like, it doesn't look like a healthy place to have, the collection of knowledge and the collection of people. And we became interested in the system as a result of that. And so we've started to look at what the procurement and the regulatory conditions are, and kind of they're very fascinating. And
I think it relates to like
There's
what
a-
Ed was presenting too about the sort of the
Right.
grants and different things that are available.
so in New York State, by law, if a locality wants to build,
Yeah.
wants to build or renovate or add to a library or to create digital literacy in the library, the state will fund that project to the magnitude when they determine a locality to be underrepresented, what's the term? Disadvantaged, I suppose. They'll fund up to 90%, and if you're not disadvantaged, 50%. There's a lot of room in here. We just sort of dug into this, but it's kind of fascinating that there are regulatory issues that are set out already for localities to improve or to build new.
So I think, Ted, when you were presenting, we were talking about doing the pro bono work. So I think a lot of, in a similar way, but what we're looking to set up with Civic is really setting up a sort of not-for-profit that is helping communities do the initial, in a sense, like feasibility studies that allow them to get to the application for the grants. Because I think what we're finding, and we had a project actually in Connecticut that also prompted us, that was a similar thing where we did some pro bono work and realized that we were helping what was a former Carnegie Library that was actually being used as a different program, a perfect example of libraries sort of transitioning, and them needing the help to apply for the grant because they needed actual documentation of what plans and elevations and budgeting, and they couldn't do that nor had the money to hire an architect. So a lot of what Civic is doing is starting to do partnerships with communities so that we can help foster that process, because a lot of times that's where the discontinuity is, and it's very difficult to then actually get these grants. So we're going to back up a little bit to give you a little context, show you a couple of examples of our work. These are back in Manhattan, not Manhattan, Kansas, but Manhattan, New York, where we've been doing our 5 libraries, but again, Civic is everything but being in the city. It's the work outside of the city and the rural, but I think again this connection between urban and rural, we find that the approach to our urban libraries, although very dissimilar in certain ways, it's still very much about community and local communities, again, because we're working on branch libraries that are predominantly between 8 and like 12,000 square feet, so they're smaller buildings.
So these are the central libraries of the 3 systems. So 3 out of the 23 systems in New York State are in New York City, and those systems are comprised of NYPL, New York Public Library, that is comprised of Staten Island, the Bronx, and Manhattan, and there are 92 branch libraries in that system. Brooklyn Public Library, which is only the borough of Brooklyn, is about 60 buildings, and Queens Public Library is just Queens and is 62. So that's about 214 out of that 765 buildings, branch libraries that occur in New York City, which is a lot. But then, if you think about it, there's also a whole hell of a lot that's outside of the city, and that's really what got us thinking about civic. These are
We're
floor
gonna go
plans,
quickly through these. These are just our
Yeah.
5 libraries, and we're just gonna kind of go through them.
and they all have their urban contexts. As we would argue, even a library in a rural situation has its sort of context, whether you call it rural
And
or
it's
whatever.
usually a hybrid of urban and rural, because libraries typically are on the main street.
Yeah.
I mean, that was even going back to Carnegie in terms of what properties and where libraries. It was something that often also was close to public transportation of some sort, if possible. So, I think libraries actually straddle that urban and rural because they're often off of Main Street, even if they're in a rural context.
We don't show it in these diagrams, but every single one of these contexts would also have the movement of the sun throughout the day and the seasons. And you're not gonna get away from
So we're gonna go through really quick before and after. This is our East Flatbush Library, before that again wasn't super open, and then afterwards, in terms of, it got kind of renovation, but renovating an existing library and interiors and bringing in light and transparency, a lot of what Ted was talking about with some of these buildings,
north-facing skylights
create more community connection to the street.
that cut down on the energy usage throughout the day. This is the Red Hook Public Library, which is in the neighborhood of Red Hook, which is
Brooklyn.
in Brooklyn, very, very low, and was impacted by Hurricane Sandy.
This is actually going to be, this is under construction. Do we have construction progress? Oh. This is going to be Brooklyn Public Library's first net zero building, so we're talking about sustainable. It's essentially off the grid.
And what the story of the library is, because of the flooding, we've had to add 18 inches to essentially a slab to resist the force of the water when it comes into the groundwater and up. But this building, as you can see, it was rather low. The height of the beam at the door right here was at 7 foot. So if we added 18 inches, of course you can't get into the building. So we've raised this concrete roof, we've raised it instead of 18 inches, we raised it 6 feet. So instead of having a compressed space, as it's been since 1974, it's gonna be about almost a 14.5-foot ceiling to the underside of these little T-beams that we've preserved. So we've worked with a company to raise the roof.
This library will be complete and open at the end of the summer or the fall, and so that one's almost done. This was another library this was actually a temporary library that was in operation for about 5 or 6 years, temporary. That we did a library within a church, so it was also kind of this idea of placemaking is something that's really important, not only when we do our libraries, but in this condition where we were inserting a library within a church and still trying to give a sense of place and identity to the community of those that are visiting the library. So, a lot of that is part of that work of creating a sense of place.
And tying into the culture
yeah.
of place too. This is, you'll see, there's text on this glowing wall that is Walt Whitman's poem called Crossing Brooklyn Ferry that was written about the Brooklyn Heights neighborhood. So telling the stories and based on cultural artifacts of the place. This is Queens. This is the one we're doing in the Queens Public Library System. It's called Baisley Park. Kind of a fascinating building that was the architect, also about a 1970 building, was obsessed with circles. So we've been kind of reinforcing circles, recladding. A lot of the brick is in disrepair.
And that's actually just started construction. Yeah, so interiors are just creating these light-filled spaces.
And working with an artist who takes apart 5-gallon buckets that kind of wash up on the shore he's Ghanaian, and then wires these little squares together. And he's now actually transformed this tapestry into a children's story. He worked with children in the neighborhood to create narratives, so there's actually imagery.
And that's the wonderful part about working with these projects, is that there's community meetings, but there's community engagement. So the artists, most of these libraries have a percent for art aspect to them, and the artists work with the local community. So in this case, this artist came in, worked with all the kids, and now the piece in the library is based on the pieces that he worked with the kids. So there's this, not only a sense of place, but a sense of sort of like agency or like ownership, that like this place is really mine, because then one of these multi-purpose rooms is being clad with the work that the children from the community worked on.
One other aspect of this building you'll see in the greenery around, which is a little bit underrepresented here, is that many libraries were built set in from their lot lines in New York City. So there's about a 15-foot space often where there could have been gardens, but there often weren't. They were just sort of, you know, placed in the sort of in the midst of concrete or asphalt. And so we've been actually able to move the entry to this side off of this very busy kind of truck-centered roadway to the side garden space. So, you know, it kind of creates a plaza and a sense of that, that sort of garden space, and also children's gardens that we're also doing at this library, which is in Borough Park, which is an Orthodox, predominantly Orthodox Jewish neighborhood, also ringed, as you can see, by concrete, and then the brick has actually been deteriorating.
And a lot
as
of these
has the steel
libraries, going back to, you know, they're sort of, they have fences around them, they have gardens, and those are fenced in. So a lot of it is just kind of eliminating that sort of defensive space and making it more welcoming and opening, and then creating gardens and libraries that are adjacent to it, so that there's a more sort of open, but also it's like the building itself is public, but in many cases with also our Red Hook Library and our Baisley Library and with Borough Park, to create an open garden space that's open 24 hours a day. You don't even have to go into the library to enjoy some of these garden
The
spaces.
conversations we've had around not putting security gates on buildings has been unbelievable.
A lot of-
we've actually,
Yeah.
I'm going to go back just because this is something that's pretty exciting. This neighborhood was just tagged just throughout, and this library's been open for 3 years now.
There was
it's,
a lot of concern
oh,
about
people are
needing to
going
have
to
roll
spray
down
paint,
gates.
fall over, and we need to have gates. And the library really, you know, fought for this as well. Just keep it open, because they have to go through a city agency, so they have to convince the city to not have security gates as well. And so every time we go back to the library, it's such a, it's quite gratifying to just see that, you know, they made that commitment to openness and to design, and the community has responded. And then this is, and then so this is the interior of the Borough Park Library. And then so finally, you know, it's a story of decarbonization that we want to be telling through these buildings. The library, Sustainable Library Initiatives, they're way out ahead. They want to do all these things. We can bring embodied carbon into the conversation. It's not just about, you know, insulation and triple glazing. It's about the carbon that goes into the materials and reusing certain buildings in the city and not, you know, demolishing and building new unless, of course, completely necessary. So there's there's a whole series of ways of just having to like look at the complexities of the built environment around these buildings, building with healthy materials, and bringing them into the environment of the buildings.
So that's
Thank you.
civic. Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. Well, I'm really thrilled to have the two groups here. I mean, it seems like such an interesting balance of different civic structures and places that people can come together, even across all kinds of different, you know, what Lynn was mentioning about different ages, different backgrounds. And I think, you know, what you all have spoken about has been a lot of the kind of impulse that I had coming here. And I do find that it is still hard to get people to go to places that are newer because it is new. And when Charlie, who was just here, is curating an exhibition in our gallery, and several people were like hesitant to come to put their work up because they don't know us and they don't know what it will be like. And I find that these are interesting questions. I don't know, do you all have these kinds of experiences? Do you think, you know, I mean, Prattsville had a fairground, at one time. And, you know, they used to have an opera house. I don't know if they had a library years and years ago, but, you know, we have our library and people do take things out, but it's, you know, I'm just curious, what do you all think are the potentials for these kind of civic systems to work in a region like ours? Or what could make them work, I guess? Yeah.
On the library front, I think the design work is great, beautiful projects. The list of things that happen in the libraries is totally fascinating because, you know, they used to be the depositories for books and that was pretty much it, and there were some tables. And now they really are more like, I mean, they're kind of like the fairgrounds in a way. They're these super flex spaces. And the key to, the design challenge is making them work for all of those other activities. Not just book borrowing, because, you know, the books are kind of dissolving anyway, but there's all this other stuff that's coming up, including physical activity of all things, right? So, they're like wise.
Yeah, I mean, I was actually thinking about, you know, your presentation and where you were saying, obviously, the county fair happens only once a year, and then how do the buildings get used the other times? Like, we have the same conundrum or challenge or opportunity, it just happens in a more compressed time, but like what we're finding, not only in terms of how we design the libraries are different because of their sort of programmatic changes of this sort of flexibility, but also they're almost all now asking us to design a kind of after-hour civic space that is inside the library itself, so that because they know that they can't have the library open all the time after hours, so we constantly are having like where there's another entry with 2 means of egress and all that to have an assembly space. Sometimes it's just a room like this size that's access to bathrooms and full accessibility, that is the rest of the library is closed off. So this idea of like, we're really interested in that kind of after hours, the cycle of even when the library's closed, how is the building? So this, you know, shared resources, but even shared economies. Like we're finding that there's a lot of partnerships that are happening with the libraries, whether it's with local public schools that have, you know, certain programmatic deficits, or the libraries having certain inability to sort of be able to do stuff within their sort of building, and then having collaborations or shared resources in terms of using another space, but then it's like a satellite program for the library. So there's a lot of that kind of exchange that's happening that is actually changing the architecture a lot.
And it's so interesting because when we first started working in libraries, I think like 2008, you know, all the librarians, the project managers, they said, you know, don't worry about the books so much because they're going to go away. You know, and so, but we've got all these other things that need to happen. And so, okay, and then you know, the projects take a very long time in the city. So you know, let's say in the mid-teens, it was like, oh, guess what? The books didn't go away, but now we need even more spaces, and we were renovating these buildings that were, you know, the sort of the classic Lindsay box. It was called the libraries that were built under the Lindsay administration were 8,000 square feet. Always, just like a stamp, 8,000 square feet. We can't, you know, because of the budgets, or I should say the absurd costs that the city spends on building in the city, we couldn't expand them. But we still had to kind of be very creative about the spaces. Maybe the opposite problem that you guys are having, 40 acres.
I'll just say this, it's very interesting that we are both investigating really particular typologies. And so I think what's different about our challenge, perhaps, and even though both are kind of dealing with the same thing, which is our needs are changing at a very rapid pace, and they go beyond the requirements. As you're saying, particular square footage for something that has been one way for many years is changing. And so I think one difference is, and you may already know with the county fairgrounds, is that these barns are open throughout the year. So you could walk on any county fairground, walk in and out of barns and see the pins, like everything is already there. Yet there's no such like fear about safety, right? Like there are no gates, not that you can walk in. Sometimes they're gated, but for the most part you can walk in and out. But with the library it's a very different issue because it's, even though it's a public space and somewhere we can think we can just walk in, it's enclosed. It's, you know,
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I think the challenge is a lot more different about how do you activate, yeah.
I was just saying that just different levels of access is,
Yeah.
you know, something we've been thinking about, and it's in a very preliminary phase at this point, but one of the like design artifacts for us right now is essentially a year-long calendar of like all of the particular like different types of events, different durations, how they get used, and how you take, you know, on the one hand, the long span structure, a big open space, yes, it is flexible, but putting, you know, the right kind of, or understanding how to make that not necessarily generic at the same time, I think is one of the challenges for these adaptable barns, or how they're adapted in that
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, the back to the point of access too, you know, we also, especially with the gardens, we create children's gardens and children's spaces. And, you know, we have to design for safety, you know, and we're always kind of, you know, they can't be open, they have to be, and they have to be able to be seen from the main librarian's position as well as the children's librarian's position. So there's a lot of, you know, very important surveillance that has to happen. It's a design.
I was gonna say that too, that I think nowadays libraries, like all buildings, have more security. It's not just gates, but, you know,
It's true.
For
Yeah.
sure.
just the ability to see. I worked with a library that wanted to change so that their circulation desk could see every place in the library,
That's right. Yeah. And then,
which was a huge challenge.
it's a huge.
And then when you talk about out of doors, and then there's the whole problem of staffing. I mean, a lot of libraries that are losing money
Yep.
Right.
and are gonna lose more money now with our current
And so
administration.
that becomes that design challenge. How does that desk
Yeah.
get designed, and how do the bookshelves around it, you know, they can't get too tall. So how do you deploy all of these things in order to deal with an understaffed, you know, situation?
And create a space, and I keep thinking back to Ted, what you were talking about, like that idea of transparency or something that glows at night, like to create a space that doesn't feel like it is about creating security. You need security, but you also don't, you know, we're fighting to get rid of the fences, to get rid of the sort of solidity of the facade, but you also need those things, and so
Yeah, and
it's like,
contradictory to what most libraries have been,
right,
which is
exactly.
anyone can walk in.
Right, exactly. And for us, especially with branch libraries, because those really need to feel like they're part of the community. They sort of, the central libraries are kind of, they have a different sort of prominence, and I think they can be off-putting, actually. So, yeah.
Thank you both. I'm thinking about like how do you address like up here because libraries are funded by taxpayer dollars. A lot of the libraries have been like half, you know, at least half the population of each town actually wants to close the library because they don't want tax dollars going to the libraries, and that's like one of the that you know combined with. So it's sort of like difficult to start talking about design when it's like that very existence of the library is under threat. And so it's like, how do we deal with that? And I'm also thinking about, and then how do you deal with like the, you know, yes, these changes that are happening so fast in terms of like people not really reading books anymore, people not really reading at all anymore. And then I'm thinking about like for the, you know, farm buildings or the county fair things, it's like, well, how do you I'm just thinking about how they are the site of really showcasing agriculture and our relationship to land and our relationship to animals. And so much of the 4-H program is about domination of both of those things. And so it's like, how do you square, you know, in the first conversation that I'm sorry that we missed a lot of, it's, you know, we're thinking about how you can really shape, you know, or like do your best to have the architecture, you know, at some maybe like minor level influence like the way people interact with their surroundings, whether it's like the outside or the inside. And so it's like, and you know, so it's like, how are you designing these farm buildings, these buildings that are designed to house animals or showcase our relationship to the natural world in ways that actually you know, or like what are you encouraging with the buildings, and what are you encouraging with a building that's disposable? Like what's the message to like with a disposable building?
That's
Do you
super
wanna
interesting.
start? Or do
Maybe you
want me
start
to?
since.
Well, I was just
Okay.
gonna say, one of the things I think that you guys are addressing is, that's such that's a
Yeah.
hugely wide-ranging
Right.
and fascinating conversation to talk about how design, how do we as designers think about our relationship to the natural world and to animals when
Yeah,
we're
but
designing
also just
spaces
like
for them.
contemporary realities. Like so you're designing something and like that's inherently futuristic. And so it's like
Yeah.
how is this you know, futuristic place or like this proposed place addressing both like current and future realities? Because like it just feels like the underpinnings of all of it is like collapsing.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I think you guys, by designing, focusing on the space between,
Yeah.
everything but, we call it everything but the building. And, because we're always think about that space. And by understanding that that's such an important, at least our relationship amongst our other humans, and I think the animals and natural world is another issue that's fascinating, but I think that that's a really interesting place to go. It's the building, but it's everything in between. It's how you site, it's how you put something on the land. And
Right, and what I saw was
relationship.
hardscaping. And so I'm sort of like, well, how does hardscaping, what is the message does that send?
Yeah.
I also want to just, your question specifically to the libraries and the idea of tax dollars. I mean, for us, and I mean, again, this is part of this discussion because it's a great question, but I think redefining the library, right? Like if everyone feels like they have agency and ownership of the building. I mean, there are libraries across the country where you can take out a lawnmower on loan. I mean, that's how much libraries are changing their programs. So if how we define a library becomes something that everyone feels like that they're invested in or have agency, then there's less, it's a resource, exactly, because it has that sort of flexibility embedded in it. Then perhaps there's less resistance of like not wanting my tax dollars. I think no one wants to spend their tax dollars on something that they're not using as a resource.
That's what becomes the messaging.
If it becomes, which I think is what the libraries are doing, is actually making it where like that's what after hours programs are. Like you can, there are other programs that are feeding into the libraries and they're offering basically community spaces for people to gather, whether it's any type of kind of community gathering, civic gathering, or otherwise. I mean, there are, most of the libraries that we do, like there are knitting classes. There's a really interesting way in which people are beginning to trade, knowledge of craft. And there are like knitting classes, and you're getting multi-generational classes where you're having different people that are sharing their ability to knit or to weave. And so if the buildings become just a place of gathering, of sharing, or even eating, we're asked to add kitchens for after-school eating programs. Like, if there's like a shared kitchen community that is part of the library space, then I think perhaps there'd be less resistance to like tax dollars. I think it's only when it's narrowly defined, then there are people like, well, I'm not gonna use it for that,
So it's
why?
messaging, yeah.
It's messaging a little bit, yeah.
I would just add on to that, the local public library here that you pictured was actually in Tannersville, the Mountaintop Library System. You can go in on several days a week and get assistance in answering any technical question you have with your computer, which for me at my age it is great because I don't have to go back to school to learn new systems that are coming out. And I would think this is true of the county fairgrounds, that they are also learning institutions, and they should be approached as that, like invested in future and developments in technology and all sorts of scientific developments. But it's fantastic to have this resource. I no longer think of the library as just a place for books, although it's great for that. But it's really terrific to think, I can just go over to the library and ask a technical question. How do I do this? How do I do that?
That's actually a significant, in New York, I'm sure it's many states, but